completely shattered by the man I loved, branding me a broken, useless Omega. I lingered in the pouring rain outside the Kensington estate, with a heavy engagement ring burning in my pocket. However, that golden alpha remained entirely oblivious to the fact that his own brother was on the verge of altering my fate forever. I am breaking the non-disclosure agreement the Hastings family lawyers forced me to sign. At this point, I don't care about their threats, their PR machines, or their endless wealth. People need to know what hides behind the velvet ropes of modern high society, and more importantly, they need to know what Arthur Hastings truly is. My name is Zio Campbell. 2 years ago, I was living what every tabloid called the modern-day Cinderella story. I was a middle-class art history student at University College London who happened to catch the eye of Arthur Hastings, the youngest heir to the Hastings shipping conglomerate. They are essentially British corporate royalty. Arthur was the golden alpha blonde charismatic, emitting a crisp, intoxicating scent of bergamot and expensive gin. When he claimed me as his intended mate, my face was plastered on the cover of every gossip magazine in the country. But there was always a shadow hanging over our relationship. In our world, an Omega's primary duty, especially one marrying into a dynasty like the Hastings, is to produce strong alpha heirs. For months, Arthur's family had been pressuring us to finalize the mating bond, which required a comprehensive fertility workup. I'll never forget the cold, sterile air of the Harley Street clinic. Dr. Aris Pendleton, a top-tier reproductive endocrinologist for the elite, sat across from me with a file that felt as thick as a death warrant. "Zio, I'm afraid the ultrasound and your blood panels confirm our suspicions," Dr. Pendleton said, his voice stripped of any bedside manner. "You have severe scent gland hyperplasia, combined with a dormant reproductive cycle. Your hormone levels are entirely stagnant. In clinical terms, you are what we call a defective Omega. The chances of you carrying a pup to term are less than 1%. Even if a knot were to take, your body wouldn't sustain the pregnancy." The words felt like physical blows. Defective. In the Omegaverse hierarchy, especially among the old money elites, it was a death sentence for a relationship. I had always noticed my scent was incredibly faint, a mild hint of vanilla that most alphas couldn't even detect. But Arthur had told me he liked how unobtrusive I was. I thought it was love. I was terribly naive. I brought the medical file back to the Hastings estate that evening. It was the night of the annual winter gala. The mansion was crawling with politicians, celebrities, and billionaires. Arthur pulled me into his father's oak-panelled study before the event, began demanding to know the results of the clinic visit. When I handed him the paperwork, I watched the man I loved transform. The charming, media-trained smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Defective." Arthur practically spat the word, tossing the medical file onto the mahogany desk. "Are you joking, Zio? You let me parade you around for 2 years, knowing you were entirely useless." "I didn't know," I pleaded, tears burning my eyes. "Arthur, please. The doctor said there are treatments. We can try IVF. We can—" "I don't do test tube pups, Zio," he interrupted, his alpha pheromones flaring aggressively, suffocating me with the bitter scent of burnt citrus. "I need an heir. A natural, pure-blooded heir to secure my position on the board. Do you know what my father would say if I mated a barren Omega? I'd be the laughing stock of the city." "But you love me," I whispered, my voice breaking. Arthur let out a cold, hollow laugh. "Love, Zio, you were a convenient, pretty distraction. You had a clean background, you looked good in a tuxedo, and you didn't cause scandals. But a Hastings alpha does not mate with a charity case." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside was the ancestral sapphire mating ring he was supposed to present to me that very night. Instead of putting it on my finger, he snapped the box shut. "Pack your things," he ordered, adjusting his designer cufflinks without even looking at me. "My PR team Fiona will draft a statement saying we separated amicably due to irreconcilable differences. You will sign an NDA and you will leave the estate tonight. I have a gala to attend, and frankly Oliver Pembroke is out there waiting for me. He's a prime Omega Zeo. Something you will never be." He turned on his heel and walked out, leaving me alone in the study. My heart didn't just break. It shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The Golden Prince was nothing more than a ruthless, calculating monster. I stumbled up the grand staircase to the guest wing, my chest heaving with silent sobs. The music from the ballroom downstairs mocked me, a sweeping string quartet playing while my entire life was dismantled. I pulled my battered duffel bag from the closet, the same one I had brought with me when I moved in, and started throwing my clothes into it, haphazardly. Sweaters, jeans, books, everything that smelled like me, which according to the doctors wasn't much at all. "You're packing the wrong way. You'll wrinkle the cashmere." I jumped, spinning around. Leaning against the doorframe of my bedroom was Alexander Hastings. If Arthur was the family's golden prince, Alexander was the phantom. He was Arthur's older brother by 2 years, but he had been systematically erased from the family's public image. He was illegitimate, the product of an affair their father had with a French socialite. Alexander was an alpha, but unlike Arthur's refined, polished demeanor, Alexander was entirely rough edges. He had dark, untamed hair, a faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow from a youthful brawl, and he ran the grim, unglamorous logistics of the shipping empire from the shadows. We had barely spoken in 2 years. Alexander always kept his distance, watching me with dark, unreadable eyes from the corners of rooms. "Get out, Alexander," I choked out, wiping furiously at my wet cheeks. "I'm leaving. Your brother got what he wanted." Alexander stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. The heavy oak clicked into place, muting the music from downstairs. "I heard what happened in the study," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Arthur is a loud, arrogant fool. He always has been." "Don't mock me," I snapped, zipping my bag with trembling hands. "I'm not mocking you, Zeo," Alexander said softly. He stepped closer, and for the first time in my life, I felt the sheer weight of his presence. His scent hit me, not the sharp, overpowering citrus of his brother, but something deep, grounding, and intoxicating. It smelled like damp cedar, rain-soaked earth and crushed pine needles. Suddenly, a strange, terrifying heat bloomed in the pit of my stomach. My knees buckled slightly, and I gripped the edge of the bed to steady myself. My breath hitched. This was impossible. I was a defective Omega. My cycle was practically dead. Dr. Pendleton had explicitly stated my biology was dormant, but as Alexander took another step closer, my body betrayed every medical textbook in London. My internal temperature spiked. A soft, involuntary whine tore from my throat. My scent, that faint, useless vanilla, suddenly flared, deepening into a rich, intoxicating aroma of caramelized sugar and dark honey. Alexander froze. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the brown of his irises until his eyes were entirely black. "Zeo," he breathed, his voice thick with sudden restraint. "Your scent. I don't understand." I panted, my skin flushing crimson. The biological imperative was hitting me like a freight train. It wasn't just a heat. It was a desperate, primal awakening. The doctor said I was broken. "You aren't broken," Alexander growled, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides. He reached out his large, calloused hands, gripping my shoulders. His touch was like a live wire. "You were just with the wrong alpha. My brother is weak. His pheromones couldn't even wake you up." I should have pushed him away. I should have grabbed my bag and run out into the London rain. But I was utterly consumed by the betrayal of my ex-fiancé, the shattering of my ego, and the overwhelming, blinding haze of a genuine Omega heat. When Alexander tilted my chin up, his gaze was burning with a quiet, desperate obsession that I realized with a shock had been there for years. "Let me show you what you're really worth, Zio," he whispered against my lips. I didn't say no. I couldn't. That night was a blur of raw, unbridled desperation. There was no gentle romance, no careful courting. It was two outcasts colliding in the dark. Alexander was fiercely protective, treating me not like a fragile porcelain doll, but like something precious and vital. His scent completely enveloped me, drowning out the lingering trauma of Arthur's rejection. But reality is a cruel master. When I woke up hours later, the room was freezing. The storm raged outside against the window panes. Alexander was asleep beside me, his heavy arm draped protectively over my waist. Panic seized my throat. What had I done? I had just slept with the brother of the man who threw me away. The Hastings family would literally destroy me if they found out. They would bury me in lawsuits or worse. Moving with agonizing slowness, I slipped out from under his arm. I dressed in the dark, grabbed my duffel bag, and sneaked out the servants' exit into the freezing downpour. I didn't leave a note. I just ran. Fast forward 6 weeks. I was living in a damp, overpriced studio flat in Camden, working night shifts at a quiet bookstore to pay my rent entirely cut off from the glamorous world I once inhabited. I had blocked Arthur's number, ignored Fiona's emails regarding the NDA, and aggressively avoided the news. I also tried to forget the dark-haired alpha who had made me feel whole for exactly one night, until the mornings became unbearable. At first I blamed the nausea on the cheap takeout I was surviving on. Then I blamed the dizzy spells on exhaustion. But when I nearly passed out from the smell of a customer's strong coffee, a terrifying suspicion took root. Hands shaking, I sat on the cracked linoleum floor of my tiny bathroom, staring down at the plastic stick I had bought from the corner pharmacy. I was a defective Omega. It was a 1% chance. It was biologically impossible without medical intervention. Yet as the timer on my phone buzzed, the reality of my situation materialized in glaring, undeniable pink lines. Positive. I wasn't just pregnant. I was carrying the pup of the Hastings family's outcast, the older brother of the Alpha Prince, who had discarded me for being barren. For 3 days after the positive test, I barely left my Camden flat. The dampness of the peeling wallpaper seemed to seep into my bones, carrying the metallic tang of old pipes and rain-soaked brick. I sat on my lumpy mattress, staring at the faint streetlights, bleeding through the single dirty window, rubbing a stomach that was still perfectly flat, but entirely transformed. I was terrified. The Hastings family had lawyers who could make people disappear legally. If Arthur found out, I was carrying the next generation of his bloodline, even if it belonged to his illegitimate outcast brother. He would find a way to take the child. They would deem me unfit, a poor working-class Omega, living in a squalid studio, and snatch my pup to raise behind the iron gates of their estate. I was pulling on a frayed wool sweater, preparing for another agonizing night shift at the bookshop, when a heavy knock rattled my door. It wasn't the quick, polite rap of my elderly neighbor. It was a solid, authoritative strike that made the cheap wood splinter slightly against the frame. My heart slammed against my ribs. I backed away, my bare feet cold against the linoleum, clutching my keys like a weapon. "Zio!" The voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "Open the door. I know you're in there." "Alexander." My breath caught in my throat. I unbolted the lock with trembling fingers and pulled the door open just a crack. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, his broad shoulders practically filling the narrow space. He wore a heavy, dark charcoal overcoat that carried the crisp, unmistakable scent of night air, damp cedar, and crushed pine. Rain dripped from his dark, untamed hair, catching the flickering fluorescent light overhead. He didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed the door open gently, but firmly, stepping into my cramped reality. He looked wildly out of place, a wolf forced into a cage meant for a bird. "You are a remarkably difficult man to track down," Alexander said, his dark eyes scanning the dismal state of my apartment. He took in the leaky radiator, the stack of past-due bills on the tiny counter, and finally me. "How did you find me?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. I wrapped my arms around my stomach instinctively, a deeply ingrained biological drive to shield my core. Alexander's gaze dropped to my arms. His nostrils flared. I saw the exact moment it hit him. An alpha's sense of smell is sharp, but a father's instinct is primal. The heavy, suffocating scent of the Camden slums faded entirely as Alexander stepped closer. The air between us cracked with sudden electrical tension. "Your scent," Alexander murmured, his voice dropping an octave, losing its composed edge. He closed the distance between us, pulling off his damp gloves. "It's different. It's heavy. Sweet." He reached out his large, rough fingertips, grazing my jawline. The heat radiating from his skin was grounding, melting the icy panic that had gripped me for days. "Zio, are you—" Tears I didn't know I was holding back spilled over my eyelashes. I nodded once. A sharp breath hissed through his teeth. In a second, his arms were around me, pulling me flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling deeply right over my scent gland. The vibration of his chest against mine was a deep, possessive purr, a sound I had never ever heard from Arthur. It wasn't about control or optics. It was pure, unfiltered devotion. "I'm sorry I ran." I sobbed into his coat, the coarse wool scratching my cheek. I was terrified. I thought you'd tell Arthur. I thought they would take the pup." Alexander pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. His expression was a terrifying mix of absolute fury and fiercely protective warmth. "Arthur will never touch you. He will never touch our pup. If he tries, I will break him with my bare hands." He led me to the small couch, sitting me down, before pulling up a battered wooden chair. "I didn't come here just to find you, Zio. I came to warn you and to ask for your help." Alexander said, his tone shifting back to deadly serious. "The Hastings Empire is rotten to the core. Arthur and my father didn't just cast you aside because of your biology. They cast you aside because you are a decent person, and they require absolute, ruthless complicity from their mates." I stared at him, confused. "Complicity in what?" Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Shipping logistics is a dirty business if you want it to be. For the last 5 years, Arthur has been running an illegal shadow ledger. They've been dangerously overloading freighters, bypassing safety inspections, and forcing dock workers into grueling, unsafe conditions to cut costs. 2 months ago, a crane collapsed on the Hastings Vanguard dock in Southampton. 3 workers were permanently paralyzed. My stomach turned. It wasn't in the news. Because Arthur paid off Judge Harrison to seal the investigation and bribed the Port Authority to falsify the safety logs, Alexander growled disgust rolling off him in waves. They toss people aside when they break Zio, just like they did to you. They view human lives as acceptable collateral damage for their profit margins. The anger that had been simmering in me for 6 weeks, the shame, the humiliation, the feeling of being discarded like trash, suddenly crystallized into a sharp, burning fury. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about systemic, unchecked power, crushing anyone at a disadvantage. I've spent the last 2 years quietly gathering every falsified manifest, every wire transfer to Judge Harrison's, every email Arthur sent, ordering the cover-ups. Alexander explained, his eyes burning with quiet intensity. I was a ghost in that house, so they never bothered to hide their sins from me. The final piece of evidence came through this morning. I am going to tear their empire to the ground. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice steadying. Because Arthur broke you publicly. He humiliated you to elevate himself. Alexander said, softly, reaching out to lace his fingers through mine. The warmth of his palm was an anchor. I am going to destroy him at the annual board gala tomorrow night. I want you standing next to me when I do it. I want him to look at the Omega he called Defective, the man carrying the true heir to whatever is left of this family, and know that we were the ones who ended him. A week ago, I would have cowered. I would have hid in this damp room and prayed the world forgot me. But the scent of cedar in the room, the protective weight of Alexander's hand in mine, and the tiny, fluttering pulse of life growing inside me fundamentally changed my chemistry. I was done being the victim. What do I need to wear? I asked. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Alexander's face. The Savoy Hotel ballroom was a masterclass in opulent intimidation. Vaulted ceilings dripping with crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over hundreds of the country's wealthiest elites. The air was a suffocating, thick mixture of expensive floral perfumes, heavy musks, and the sharp tang of vintage champagne. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, wearing a sleek, tailored navy suit Alexander had bought for me. The fabric was soft, forgiving against my waist, and entirely devoid of the flashy, ostentatious diamonds Arthur used to make me wear. Beside me, Alexander was a monolith in black formal wear, radiating a calm, predatory patience. Below us, standing on a raised dais, was Arthur Hastings. He looked every bit the golden alpha prince, a sickeningly charismatic smile plastered on his face as he held a microphone. Standing obediently by his side was Oliver Pembroke, a prime Omega draped in white silk, looking more like an accessory than a partner. Ladies and gentlemen, board members and esteemed guests. Arthur projected his voice, smooth and heavily practiced. Tonight marks a new era for Hastings shipping. As my father steps down, it is my profound honor to officially accept the position of Chief Executive Officer. Together with my intended mate Oliver, we will lead this company into a future of unparalleled prosperity. The room erupted into polite, synchronized applause. Alexander checked his heavy steel watch. "It's time," he murmured. He pressed his hand to the small of my back, a warm, reassuring pressure. "Ready? Tear it down," I whispered. We descended the grand marble staircase just as the applause began to die down. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom had already been locked by the hotel staff under Alexander's quiet payroll. Our entrance was not loud, but the sheer, overwhelming wave of Alexander's alpha pheromones rolling into the room made heads snap in our direction. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Whispers broke out immediately, a hissing wave of gossip as the elites recognized the disgraced ex-fiancé walking side by side with the bastard older brother. Arthur's smile froze. From 50 feet away, I could smell his scent souring. The crisp bergamot instantly turned acrid, smelling like burnt orange peels and panic. He gripped the microphone stand, his knuckles turning white. "Alexander." Arthur barked over the microphone, trying to maintain his authoritative facade, though his voice cracked slightly. "This is a private executive function. You and your companion are not welcome here. Security." No guards moved. Alexander had already handled them. We reached the base of the dais. I looked up at the man who had shattered my heart and felt absolutely nothing but pity. He looked small. "I see you're still picking up my cast-offs. Alexander." Arthur sneered, dropping the microphone and stepping to the edge of the stage, lowering his voice for the surrounding board members. "Did you really bring the Baron Omega here to ruin my night? Have some dignity, Zio. Scurry back to whatever hole you crawled into." I didn't flinch. Instead, I let my own scent flare. Unrepressed by fear or blockers, the rich, heavy aroma of caramelized sugar and dark honey flooded the immediate area. It was undeniably maternal. It was the scent of a pregnant, thriving Omega. Arthur physically recoiled, his eyes darting to my stomach and back to my face in sheer horror. "Impossible," he breathed. "Pendleton said your cycle was dead." "Dr. Pendleton was measuring my reaction to you, Arthur," I said, my voice steady and carrying a quiet, lethal calm. "I wasn't defective. You were just inadequate." A few gasps echoed from the nearby board members, including Penelope Carmichael, the company's chief financial officer, who looked thoroughly scandalized. Before Arthur could recover from the public castration of his alpha ego, Alexander stepped forward, pulling a thick leather portfolio from his coat. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked directly at the front row of VIP tables. "Members of the board." Alexander's voice boomed, projecting effortlessly without a microphone. "My brother is not taking the position of CEO tonight. In fact, he will be stepping down from all corporate duties, effective immediately." Arthur's father, Lord Richard Hastings, stood up from his table, his face purple with rage. "Enough of this nonsense, Alexander. Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing." "You're going to be a bit too busy for that, Richard," Alexander replied coldly. He tossed the thick leather portfolio onto the table, directly in front of Alistair Harrington, the chief compliance officer. Inside that folder are the unredacted shadow ledgers for the Hastings Vanguard operations. It details explicit, calculated violations of maritime safety laws authorized by Arthur. It includes the bank transfers from offshore accounts used to bribe Judge Harrison to bury the crane collapse that paralyzed 3 men. And it contains the falsified cargo manifests that have been scamming your top shareholders for the last 5 years. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Alistair Harrington ripped open the portfolio, his face draining of color as his eyes scanned the documents. "This is a lie," Arthur screamed, losing all semblance of his media-trained polish. He looked feral, his pheromones spiking into a foul, choking stench. "He forged them. He's a bastard, trying to steal my inheritance." "I don't need to forge anything," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I CC'd the National Crime Agency and the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency 20 minutes ago." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom were thrown open. A dozen plainclothes investigators, flanked by uniformed police officers, marched into the room. The golden illusion of the Hastings Empire shattered right then and there. There was no grace in Arthur's downfall. He didn't surrender with dignity. He screamed, cursed, and practically shoved Oliver Pembroke aside in a desperate, pathetic attempt to flee out a side door, only to be immediately tackled by 2 officers. Lord Richard slumped into his chair, clutching his chest, as an investigator read him his rights, his legacy turning to ash in his mouth. Hard karma had finally arrived, and it wore handcuffs. I watched Arthur being dragged away, his designer tuxedo rumpled, his dignity entirely stripped. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes wild with regret and disbelief, realizing that the Omega he threw away was standing over the ruins of his life. I turned away before he disappeared through the doors. I didn't need to see the rest. 6 months later, the smell of damp brick and stale rain was completely gone from my life, replaced by the scent of fresh paint turpentine and Alexander's grounding cedar. The Hastings Shipping Company had been heavily sanctioned, but the board had begged Alexander to take over the restructuring. He agreed on one condition: massive systemic overhauls to worker safety, and a massive compensation fund for the dock workers and families injured under Arthur's regime. Arthur and his father were currently awaiting trial, facing decades in federal prison, entirely cut off from the society that once worshipped them. I sat on a wooden stool in the sunlit studio of the community art centre we had just opened in South London, funded entirely by the newly ethical Hastings Trust. I had a paintbrush in one hand, but my attention was focused on the heavy, comfortable weight pulling at my lower back. Alexander walked into the studio, rolling up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, a smudge of dark ink on his jaw from reviewing contracts. He walked up behind me, wrapping his large arms around my heavily pregnant belly, resting his chin on my shoulder. "They're kicking again," he murmured, feeling the sharp thump against his palm. His voice was entirely soft, devoid of the harshness he used for the corporate world. "They know their alpha is here." I smiled, leaning back against his solid chest, breathing in the scent of pine and rain. I wasn't a defective Omega, and I wasn't a pawn in a gilded cage. I was exactly where I was meant to be, building a life from the ashes of a broken empire, rooted in something deeply, undeniably real. And that's how Zio turned his darkest heartbreak into the ultimate triumph, from a discarded so-called defective Omega to the powerful mate of the true Hastings, as Zio and Alexander proved that real strength lies in loyalty, not titles. Did Arthur get exactly what he deserved? Let us know in the comments. If you loved this intense tale of betrayal and hard-earned karma, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.